everyone, Carly here. We have an enticing selection of Big Feels Canonverse Fics for you on the podcast this week. Baby Kraken is narrating 3 short fics for you, and we're bringing the full range of emotions. We've got a little angst and complicated feelings with the first 2, then something lighter to conclude things. First is Wash Away by Spookyscarygenderfuck. Edward is in a spiral of depression after Steve left and the Kraken took over. Izzy decides it's time for him to clean up and start to live again. Written for day 6 of OFMD Kinktober for the prompt bathing/grooming. This is rated mature, and some of the tags are, "This is sad, okay?" but it has a hopeful ending.
Hello, friends. I am currently dressed as Kraken Ed because I've been trying out some hair and makeup for Comic-Con in October. I thought it was quite appropriate to read this fic, which is about Ed in his spiral of depression after the Kraken took over. This is Wash Away by Spookyscarygenderfuck. I will be doing the voices. Izzy poured the last bucket into the absurdly large tub. He refused to admit to himself that he was thankful to have it there right then. He walked back out to the cabin and worked on helping Ed stand up. He was in some state between blackout drunk and sobbing so hard he couldn't hear Izzy speaking to him. Izzy worked the robe off his shoulders, thankful that Ed hadn't bothered dressing otherwise. They'd seen each other naked plenty of times. This was no different. And it wasn't even something Izzy could appreciate at that moment. Ed looked scrawnier than usual, having not eaten much since. Izzy licked his lips and concentrated on walking Ed to the tub. He helped him climb into it, and he sighed with relief as Edward's face flashed with something like a human emotion for the first time in ages. Ed blinked a few times, looking around him as if he'd just woken up. He met Izzy's eyes, and his started to well up again. Izzy Izzy hushed him and rolled his sleeves up. "It's all right, Edward. You're okay." He took a clean washcloth and dipped it into the water, watching Ed carefully. He used a bar of soap to get it good and sudsy before starting to clean Ed's face off. The black rubbed off fairly easily onto the cloth, and soon the Kraken was set aside on the floor as Izzy got a new one to wash the rest of Ed's body. He worked quietly for a minute. Then he began to hum softly, just a random tune he made up as he went. But it seemed to work at calming Ed even more. He cleaned every part of Ed's body with careful touches, occasionally meeting Ed's eyes and giving him what he hoped was an encouraging smile. No one could ever say he was good at being comforting, but he was good at giving Edward whatever he needed, usually. He paused his humming to sigh, a deep lump settling in his throat as he tried to push back the thoughts of guilt, the knowledge that it was his actions that had led Edward to this. Then Ed's hand came up out of the tub and grasped his. He looked at their hands touching for a moment, then back into Ed's eyes, pleading with him. "Please don't stop." Izzy nodded and took a breath before continuing his little song. making it a bit more upbeat this time. It wasn't too late. He could still help Edward recover. Edward needed him, and he intended to be there for him, whatever it took. End of fic. So sweet. That one's got a really lovely relationship between Izzy and Ed, and it gave me a great excuse to use my currently raspy voice.
That was Wash Away by Spookyscarygenderfuck. Next up is How a Life Can Move from the Darkness by adhduck. This is rated for teen and up audiences. Some of the tags are references to suicidal ideation and attempts, emotional comfort, talking it through as a crew, and this is canon compliant up to season 2, episode 3. Here's the summary. Steed is a complete and utter bed hog, and Ed just wants to get away from Steed right now. But thanks to some meddling from Anne and Mary, he's sharing a bed with him instead. Maybe it's finally time to take that advice about talking it through.
Just a content warning for this fic. It deals a lot with Ed's previous suicidal ideation and attempts, but he is in a place now where he wants to live and get better. But those feelings of depression do still crop up, so please take care. This is How a Life Can Move from the Darkness by adhduck. I will be doing the voices. The whole thing is Anne's fault. Well, it's also Steed's, but everything is sort of Steed's fault when Ed's feeling dramatic, which is only about 23 hours of every day. Anne, though, is the one who intended for this to happen. It started with Steed showing up like a leechy fucking golden retriever after Ed had stolen a dinghy and rode off into the night, which seemed like a pretty clear do not follow sign to him. But of course, Steed has never followed a cue like that in his life. So he'd showed up right as Ed was asking Anne and Mary for a spot to stay the night. And of course, they both picked up on their vibes instantly. And Anne had asked Steed to stay for dinner because she loved to watch Ed squirm. And maybe Ed could have survived that. Sit a foot away from the man who killed his heart and then saved his life. Shove some obnoxiously warm and delicious food in his mouth and flee. Sleep under a bridge if he had to. But then Anne had to meddle. "Where are you staying, Steed?" she asked in that sultry fucking tone of hers. "Well, I'm actually not sure," Steed admitted. "My ship couldn't dock here, a bit too noticeable, so they let me know they'd be back in a day or two to pick me up. I'm sure there are some lovely inns nearby, though." There weren't, Ed knew. At least none with open rooms. That was half of why he'd been asking them about a place to stay. The other half being he was fairly certain they wouldn't stab him in his sleep, something he couldn't say for most of the world. And unfortunately, he was feeling a bit attached to life at the moment. "Stay with us then," Mary said easily. "You and Ed can catch up." "Oh, is Ed staying with you?" Ed was ready to say, "No, actually, I found a beautiful little vista under a bush." But Anne was quicker. "Yes, in our guest room. The only one we have, unfortunately. But the bed is more than big enough for two." "Oh, fuck no, I am not sleeping next to him," Ed snapped. He was dutifully not looking at Steed's face when he said it, so he didn't notice Anne had stood up until he heard the scrape of her chair. "That seems a little harsh, don't you think?" she said, warm and smooth as a swig of brandy. "He is your former shipmate, after all." Ed, feeling suddenly like a fish being slowly, methodically circled by a shark, gritted his teeth and said nothing. Anne gave him a tight-lipped smile and walked around the table to Steed, her heeled boots clicking on the floor, and put a hand on his shoulder. "And He seems like such a nice man, too. Been a gentleman all day. Don't you agree, Mary? Mm-hmm, Mary said, grinning like a predator at Ed over her food. Best guest we've had in ages. Certainly seems like he'd be fine to share a bed with, Anne continued. And something flared in Ed's mind, in the pit of his stomach, at the suggestive tilt of her eyebrow, the way her fingers trailed up Steed's shoulder before curling around the back of the chair. Definitely for one night, Mary agreed, and Anne offered her a fond, conspiratorial smile. Yes, exactly. She yanked Steed's chair back several inches, the harsh scrape of it nearly overpowering the blood pumping in Ed's ears, and gave Ed a faux questioning look. But it's still a no? Ed glared at her as hard as he could, trying to put some Blackbeard in there for good measure. No. A second after he said it, he realised it maybe wasn't clear whether he meant, my answer is no, or no, it's still a no. But Anne clearly had interpreted it as the former, because at that moment she swung her leg over Steed's chair, planted herself in his lap, and kissed him. Looking back, Ed was grateful Anne and Mary had implemented a no weapons policy at the table, at least for guests, because the first thing his thoroughly fried brain thought to do was go for his belt. Then he saw her hand creeping towards Steed's neck, that devastatingly bare bit of skin, and suddenly he was on his feet and roaring, "Enough!" Anne pulled back with a long-suffering glare, turning to look at Ed with a challenge bright in her eyes. Steed, for his part, was staring at Anne in utter shock and, thank fuck, a bit of discomfort. "I'll share the fucking bed," Ed grit out, doing his best not to tackle Anne to the ground. "Happy?" Eyes still half-lidded, Anne smiled and lifted herself cleanly off Steed's lap. "Perfectly." So now he and Steed are sharing a fucking bed. Steed, with that scandalously undone new shirt and the same old smile. Steed, who left Ed waiting all night like a kicked puppy, then left him to hover over the ocean for months until he was too tired to do anything but drown, then wouldn't let him. Steed, who was fucking waiting for him, who Ed can't even look at without wanting to claw out of his skin with hope and guilt and terror and bone-deep exhaustion. It's already torture being in a room alone with him, and then figuring out how to situate themselves without touching. Steed on his back, Ed on his side facing away, and the long, long minutes waiting for Steed to fall the fuck asleep so Ed can stop hyper-analysing every shift and sound he makes. But the real fucking kicker is that Steed is a complete and utter bed hog. Ed already guessed this, to be fair. The man sprawls across his whole life the same way, totally unaware of how much space he takes up, of where he shouldn't fit. But before everything, it had been a source of idle fantasy for Ed. He'd wake up on the settee, cramped and aching, and imagine it was actually because Steed had pushed him to the edge of the bed, their bed, the bed they shared. Imagine he could roll his eyes and push Steed back over like he did every night. Maybe wrap him up in his arms so he couldn't take up too much room. And Steed would make a sleepy little noise and pull him closer. Probably kiss his wrist or something devastatingly gentlemanly like that. But that was before. Now, Ed just wants a decent fucking night's sleep. And he can't do that with half his arse off the bed. Trying to move Steed does nothing, though, because even when Ed manages to push him against the wall, Steed just sprawls back out a minute later, worse than before. So after an infuriating half hour of push and pull, Ed goes for plan B. Steed grunts as Ed hits him with the pillow. Then, when it hits him again, "Edward, what the hell are you doing?" "Trying to stop you hogging the entire fucking bed, mate," Ed hisses. "Stop hitting me with a blasted pillow then? Steed argues, throwing his hands up to block the blows. Edward! Then stay on your side and leave me the fuck alone. Steed sighs at that, loudly, and Ed's ready to hit him again when he says, Ed. And I'll fuck him. The name isn't an accusation on his lips now. It's plaintive, soft, bordering on tender, and as effective at stopping Ed as a cannonball to the skull. More so, even. Because Ed survived that. But one soft fucking word from Steed, and he's flayed in two. Ed clutches the pillow between his fingers, wanting to fight, to thrash against the weight of Steed's gaze on his. But he's too fucking tired for it. He sits up instead, feet flat on the floor, the tiny bit of blanket he managed to claim tangled in his legs, and after a moment throws the pillow across the room with an unsatisfying thump. Why are you here, Steed? He asks, quiet. Why did you follow me here? There's a slight creak of movement, but Steed doesn't sit up beside him. Good. Ed can barely manage Steed being so close already. Never mind close enough for Ed to be that aware of his fingers, his arms, the corners of his mouth. I've been following you for months, Steed says, just as quiet, but it feels so much louder. Maybe it's because there's still life left in his voice, trembling and hopeful and fierce. I was trying to find you. Well, congrats, you found me, Ed cuts in. Now can you piss off? A sigh. You know that's not all I want, Ed. Do I? Ed thinks. And it's somehow vicious and hopeful at the same time. Because until a couple of days ago, I was under the impression you didn't want even that much. Yeah, well, maybe you're the only one, he says at last, forcing some bite into his otherwise empty words. I stole a fucking dinghy in the middle of the night. Doesn't that seem like a hint to you? His body had been nearly too weak to row, blood seeping through the bandages on his arm, every breath leaving him like a new wound. But he had to do it. The other option was to stay on that fucking boat with a crew who hated and pitied him, with a Steed who pulled him back from the fucking dead and didn't even know it, who could still leave at any time. And then where would Ed be? Back in the water, pulled into the depths by a weight of his own making. No, he can't do that. He doesn't know how to live yet. But it took the fucking gravy basket to make him realise he doesn't want to die either. Steed doesn't respond for a long moment, and Ed fights the urge to look at his expression. Fucked up, honestly. To have the thing that scares him shitless be the only thing that could bring him comfort right now. If you want me to leave, if you ask me to, I'll go, Steed says at last. But if it's up to me, I want to stay. And isn't that a fucking knife to the ribs? Because Steed sounds like he means it. But he sounded like he meant it when he said Ed made him happy too, didn't he? Maybe Ed just can't tell the difference between reality and hope anymore. Oh, yeah, forgot you have a fucking death wish, he grumbles. Only enough of one to become a pirate, Steed says, and to find you again. After that, I'd quite like to live, actually. Isn't that a fucking thought? One Ed hadn't had in months. not until he awoke with a gasp, his hand clinging to some unknown warmth, and realised how long it had been since he could really breathe. Not a great track record on living around me. Yes, I was sorry to hear about Ivan, but you're still alive, aren't you? Not for lack of trying, Ed thinks, then drags his brain away from that line of thinking. Don't have to be sorry, he grunts, not like it's your fault. A long pause. I mean, in a way it is. Oh, shut up, Ed says instantly, forgetting for a moment that everything is supposed to be Steed's fault. You didn't do anything. Exactly. I rather think if I'd done something, things wouldn't have gone so poorly. One of Ed's best skills is delegating blame away from himself. But something about Steed laying here and taking it when Ed didn't even ask him to makes him furious suddenly. Fuck off. I'm the one who did all that fucked up shit, not you. Yes, but if I hadn't left, Jesus fucking Christ, man, don't you get it? I lost it. Every member of your crew and mine should be dead because of me. And I wanted that. I sailed us right into a fucking storm, hoping it would take us all. Only failed because they did the right thing and put a cannonball in my skull. I'm not the guy you've been waiting for, man. I'm not lovable, he almost says. But nope. Can't go there. I'm a bad person, Steed. I was before you left me on that dock, and no matter what you do or don't do, I'm always going to be that way. Another shift of the bed, and suddenly Steed is beside him, close enough that Ed can make out the shape of him in the dark, though part of him knows he'd make out the shape of him even with his eyes closed. That the memory of Steed is held somewhere much deeper than sight. I don't believe that, Steed says, quiet but fierce. I can't. If I can go from some useless rich boy with a ship to, well, maybe not a great captain, but at least one who can get his crew out of trouble most of the time, then you can be better too. I know you can. Ed opens his mouth, then closes it, wordless in the face of such unwavering belief that he hasn't even earned. And after a moment, Steed takes his silence as permission to continue. And even if you can't move on from all of this, I don't care. He pauses, then says, well, all right, I do. You nearly got the crew killed. And yourself. Of course I care about that. But I also care about you, Ed. And nothing you do is going to change that. Ed rolls his eyes at this. Because Steed wasn't there. He doesn't know. But Steed pushes on with all the determination of a ship meeting the storm head on. You could have put your sword through my heart, Ed would teach. And I would still love you. And that's fuck. Ed can't think about what that is. Just hearing it makes him feel like he's underwater again. Or maybe that he's just come up for air. Or maybe like his first and only love just said he loves him. While Ed sits inches away, with his whole mangled fucking heart in his throat, not knowing how to say it back. That's, he tries, and has to catch himself when his voice breaks. That's pretty fucked up, man. Steed breathes out a laugh. Ed can hear the gentle rise and fall of his shoulders as he shrugs. Then, I suppose we're both pretty fucked up, aren't we? There's an olive branch there. One Ed doesn't know how to take. And his brain scrambles for the first words he can think of to fill the space instead. If you if you feel that way, then why'd you fucking leave? Oh, fuck. Anything but that. Give him the cannonball again. Tie the rope back around his waist. Anything but hearing what about him wasn't worth waiting for. Because I didn't know. Ed blinks. The fuck does that mean? I didn't know I was in love with you, Steed explains. And fuck. He has to stop saying that, or Ed's gonna explode. Didn't know how you felt about me either, actually. Or at least didn't understand it could be a good thing. That makes something cold and familiar curl in Ed's gut. Didn't want to get tied up with someone like me. Got it. What? No, nothing like that. Never. His hand is on Ed's wrist, then, maybe unthinkingly. But Ed feels the point of contact like it's the first touch he's ever felt. It wasn't about you. It was Ed. You gave up everything for me. And that was... You have to understand. No one's ever given something up for me like that before. Not without hating me for it. And I didn't... There's a sharp hitch of breath then. And Ed hates this lightless room for not letting him see more than the shadow of Steed's face. Hates Steed for shattering both their hearts. Hates himself for being too broken to pull Steed into his arms like nothing happened at all. I didn't want that to happen to us. Steed says and laughs. A sharp, self-deprecating thing that cuts at Ed to hear. Joke's on me, I suppose. Because I did that anyway. He seems to remember he's still touching Ed then, goes to pull away, and without thinking, Ed grabs his hand. It's grounding, the feel of Steed's bare skin against his own, even as it washes him out to sea, and he whispers, "Tell me what happened." And Steed does. He tells him about the growing guilt, about remembering the family he'd abandoned, about Chauncey taking him in the night. He stumbles during that part, and Ed can tell he's holding some things back. But so is Ed. And about his panicked run through the night. Ed's not sure he'd be able to listen to Steed talk about his life back in Barbados, his wife and kids. If Steed didn't speak of it all like a distant memory. The fuckery also helps, Ed's lips curling upwards, without his permission, at the mention of the jungle cat. Things slowed down a bit once I found the crew and got us working at Spanish Jackie's, Steed says. I'll admit, I forgot how much a proper ship costs when you're starting from scratch. Ed frowns. Why the fuck did you start from scratch? Oh, yes, sorry. I forgot to mention that. I, renounced all my wealth. Oh, Ed swallows around the veritable swarm of questions that poses. All right, then. Steed goes on to tell him about the nearly successful Roman puzzle chest heist, working with Zhengyi Sao's crew, which he is way too fucking chill about, because if Blackbeard's a legend, that woman is a whole damn Parthenon, finding the revenge and breaking the crew out when they were accused of mutiny. Though Ed's not sure if it counts as mutiny if your captain wants you to do it, or if the captain feels much more anger at himself than any of the supposed mutineers. He trails off here, brought up to the present, and for a long moment Ed doesn't know what to say. None of it makes him feel any better, not even close. But it does shift something, deep inside, rearranges that heavy weight so he can take a breath without feeling something puncture. The thing is, by now, Ed has spent more time imagining what Steed might be doing than he spent with Steed. He's imagined Steed dead, sometimes by Ed's hand and sometimes by some faceless being that Ed cut down in a rage. Imagined him sailing back to Ed with all his frivolous finery and sweeping him into his arms and explaining it was all a mistake. He'd been kidnapped or injured and had never chosen anything that wasn't Ed. Imagined he'd never left at all, that this was some awful dream and he'd wake up to Steed's lips against the shell of his ear, their skin hot and tangled, and so familiar Ed couldn't tell them apart. But Ed never thought to imagine that Steed spent all this time working. Not just as a fucking waiter. Ed still can't quite imagine it. But as a captain. A sailor. A person. He's become more sure in himself, turned some of that reckless confidence into genuine competence. And he watches every member of his crew with a fierce sort of care that makes Ed ache. And Ed realises, with the same horrible clarity of a broken bone being snapped back into place, that this Steed isn't the one who left him. Not really. That old Steed is a dream. Useful when Ed wanted to feel something again. But this Steed, he's real. Real and good. And here, despite everything Ed's done. And fuck, if Ed didn't deserve him before. Ed. Steed has leaned closer. Not much. Maybe an inch at most. But for some reason, it makes tears burn in the back of Ed's eyes. He blinks them away, then forces himself to catch Steed's gaze again. His eyes have adjusted to the dark now, enough to make out the worried creases at the corners of Steed's eyes. The gentle parting of his lips. He's beautiful. Always has been, no matter how Ed looks at him. Sounds like you've been busy, he says at last, and Steed snorts. That's what Elawande said about you, actually, when we found your wanted poster. Did you ever see one? Ed shakes his head. Can't see a wanted poster when you won't let yourself touch ground. And Steed says, Oh, good. They had the worst drawing of you. Made you look like a demon. Steed says it so casually, like that wanted poster didn't certainly have a mile-long list of the horrible things Ed's done. And Ed loves and hates him in equal parts for it. I deserved that, he says. He hesitates, then adds, I probably did all of it, you know. All the shit they said. Steed purses his lips into a frown. I already told you, I don't care. But I do, Ed says, and realises he means it. He doesn't want to be forgiven, not like this. He wants to earn it, wants to become better like Steed has. Fuck. He wants to live. And he's realising that even after everything, the cord tying him to life is terrifyingly thin. Sure, he's got the chance for warmth and good food and orgasms now. But if Steed leaves him again, that's all fucked. And even if Steed doesn't, a hope he can barely even think of before he has to shove it back down, he wants there to be more. He wants to feel like he can stay alive for himself. I think, he says, words leaving his mouth almost before his brain comes up with them. I need to leave. Steed's hand clenches around his instantly. What? I need to figure my shit out, and he looks at Steed again. Lets the shadows painted across that lovely face punch him in the heart a little. I think I need to do it alone. No. Steed twists to face Ed more, eyes bright with panic. Ed, I'm here now. I'll help. Whatever you need, I want to help. I know. He thinks he does, at least. Wants to believe he does. But All of this is my fuck up. I have to fix it. Steed shakes his head. I shouldn't have left you alone in the first time. I'm not going to do it on purpose. You're not leaving me, though. I'm choosing to leave. But you'll still be alone. Steed's voice cracks on the word, takes an unsteady breath. I don't want you to be alone anymore, Ed. Fuck. Ed has to close his eyes at that, like it'll protect him from the overwhelming wave of devotion in Steed's voice. It's not forever, he says, chest squeezing around every word. I need to figure out who Ed is, without Blackbeard or the Kraken or anybody else. Figure out how to not go off the deep end again. Steed sits with that for a few moments. If that's what you need, I want that for you. But His voice wavers, and Ed holds his hand tighter on instinct. I know I have no right to ask this of you, Ed, but it's been a hell of a few days, and I need to know that you're going to be safe if you're on your own. There's an air to his voice that says he doesn't just mean not to run into any English ships. And Ed has to look away again to bear saying the next part. I don't want to go back to how I was the last few months. And this time, I know I have somewhere to land if I need to. You can always land near me, Steed says. The moment you need me, I can be there. Ed presses his lips together against a smile. Or maybe a sob. Not sure you can be there the moment. I found you this time, didn't I? Steed says defiantly. And God, Ed loves him. Doesn't matter how he's run from it, how much Steed has hurt him. Ed loves him. Loves him like the softest cashmere. Wants to run his hands all over his skin and rub his cheek against that downy soft hair and wrap himself up in him and never, ever be cold again. But first, he has to make sure he knows how to hold that softness without wearing it down into nothing. Has to make sure he can hold it without wearing himself down into nothing. There's a long bout of silence then, punctuated only by their quiet breaths, and then Steed says, What about tonight? It's a bigger question than those 3 little words imply. Though Steed has always been someone who can say one thing and mean 10. Depends on if you keep hogging the whole fucking bit, Ed says. Because somehow this is where he draws the line at saying what he means without skirting around it like a nervous dog. If it means you'll stay here tonight, Steed says, I'll sleep on the floor. Chivalrous dick, making Ed's heart flutter like this when he's trying to get it to settle the fuck down. Ed's gonna miss him so fucking much. I don't want that. Then I suppose we'll have to share 50-50, Steed says. And if I get too greedy, just pinch my arm. Mary did it for years. Wakes me right up. Ed nods, letting his lips quirk up in a smile at the vision of Steed jolting awake with a yelp night after being a bed hog. And then there's the awkward process of getting situated again. When it's dark and they're tangled up in the blankets, and Ed's heart is on his sleeve, all the way down to his fingertips. They lay side by side on their backs, with the blankets up to their necks. Ed without a pillow, because he couldn't be fucked to grab the one he threw. Their shoulders overlap, feet nearly touching. And it's not as flaying as it was before, but still, Ed wants more. Tomorrow, he's going to try to be better. But tonight, maybe he can be brave. Budge up, he whispers, pushing at Steed's shoulder. Oh, am I still taking up too much space? Steed says, apologetically, rolling onto his side when Ed keeps nudging. Sorry, is this... Oh. Ed presses up against his back, bodies touching from shoulder to feet, fit together like a key in a lock. So you can't hog the bed, Ed explains. So soft, he barely hears it himself, still dancing around what he really means, as he wraps an arm around Steed's waist. That okay? Yeah, Steed says. And it's shaky, but Ed believes him. He shifts slightly, then puts a hand over Ed's, fingers slipping between his own. And this? Yeah. Ed buries his face into the back of Steed's neck, forces himself not to cry at the rush of safety that washes over him, at the feel of soft, warm skin against his cheek. Better than any fancy silk or cashmere. Yeah, it's all right. Good, Steed says, and lets out a slow breath, their hands rising and falling on his stomach. Night, Ed. Night, Steed. Tomorrow, he'll leave this behind, find a way to live off more than the warmth of Steed's love. But tonight, he lets himself be warm.
That was How a Life Can Move from the Darkness by adhduck. Next up is Perfect on the Right Person by spanishforthecar. Beans is back. Beans is especially excited about this one.
This is Perfect on the Right Person by spanishforthecar. Like so many terrible days, it began with a bubble of hope. The evening before had been, dare he even think it, fun? The children shrieking with joy as they clambered over the furniture, chasing him down with wooden swords, all of them dishevelled and panting with laughter. Even Mary had smiled and pulled out her sketchbook to capture the chaos. And the evening had ended with all four of them cuddled together in the children's nursery, Steed reading his favourite tales of daring do, allowing himself to let loose his most theatrical voices. Mary had even squeezed his hand as they climbed into bed, saying, "Thank you for spending time with us," before they blew out the candles and turned away from each other in sleep. Steed woke up smiling, planning to ask Mary to see her sketch from the day before, wondering perhaps if she would show him some of her other drawings too. He hummed a bit as he washed up and chose a diamond-patterned, mustard-coloured coat and breeches, with an olive-green waistcoat threaded with gold leaves, and it was with an unusual spring in his step that he entered the parlour. "Good morning, darlings," he chirped, the final syllable dying in his mouth at the sight of his wife and children, huddled silent and pale on the sofa. Lewis was asleep in Mary's lap, a thumb in his mouth and tear tracks evident on his face. Mary and Alma wore twin hollowed-eyed looks, Mary's hardening into a resentful anger as her gaze met Steed's. Steed felt his bubble of hope pop, felt the glimmer of happiness drain from him like blood from a stab wound. "We've been up all night. The children had terrible nightmares. I'm taking Lewis back to the nursery and getting coffee," said Mary, her voice tight with barely suppressed rage. She departed with a rustle of skirts, leaving an icy chill in her wake. Steed sat on the couch next to Alma. Her gaze slid listlessly out the window. 3 times Steed opened his mouth to comfort her. 3 times he closed it without saying anything. He tried to stretch a hand out to her, but couldn't make his arm move. Eventually, with her face still turned to the window, she muttered a perfunctory, "May I be excused, Father?" He nodded mutely, and then she, too, was gone. Steed took breakfast alone, as usual, the clank of his fork echoing in the empty dining room, the biscuits turned to ash in his mouth, the poached egg a slimy lava. He managed only a few bites before he retreated to his study. Still alone, with the estate's record books in front of him, Steed wondered if he might cry, but found that he couldn't muster the energy needed for tears. He pictured himself flat on the ground, a disembodied hand wielding a large spoon and scooping the viscera out of his chest. He pictured himself in a massive vice, the handle turning inexorably, squeezing him until he was flat, two-dimensional, insubstantial enough to lose in a dusty corner or let loose on a breezy day. Every time he tried to be better, he made things worse. And then he spilled a bottle of ink on 2 weeks' worth of figures that he was meant to be copying for backup. 40 minutes later, Steed Bonnet is striding down Bridgetown's High Street. He takes deep breaths of sea-salty, fish-rotten, floral-sweet air, feeling the vice grip loosen, the hole in his chest start to close. A man in a striped t-shirt and a dirty apron is selling steaming packets of something wrapped in plantain leaves. He buys one, imagining with a little grin the look of horror on Mary's face. It turns out to be richly spiced, tender meat, dotted with small sweet fruits and salty, starchy fried plantains. Steed has rarely tasted anything so complex and delicious. And it's just here, on the streets of Bridgetown. There's a whole world outside of his silent, sad, oppressive house. What else has he yet to taste, yet to see, yet to feel? He turns back to the vendor and presses another coin into his hand, asking if he'd ever consider being a chef for an estate. The man grins and tells him, I like Bridgetown, I don't like plantations. You ever go to sea, you come find me. I'd leave here for that. Steed returns the smile a bit weakly. He feels slightly off kilter as he walks away, the old, barely acknowledged tide pull of the sea on his imagination, dredged up by a stranger. Steed has no plan. He had fled the house, desperate to outrun the suffocation, with a shouted excuse to Mary that he was going to town for some things, and now that he's in town, he doesn't know what those things are. And then he sees it. How could you not? It's the deepest, richest plum, the colour of the depths of the ocean, the colour of a moonless sky, an hour before dawn. It's embroidered with gold sequins and threads, delicate fern-like shoots and rolling ocean waves, from the collar to the hem, on the cuffs, along the black slit. It's velvet. And just looking at it, Steed suddenly understands the difference between being enveloped and being suffocated. In the tailor's display window, it's paired with breeches made of the same colour velvet. The waistcoat is silk in a royal purple, intricately embroidered in both silver and gold flowers. The snowy linen shirt has a relatively modest lace cuff and yabbot. The stockings and shoes are both a creamy white. Steed stares at it, entranced. Even as he admires it, his mind fills in a slightly different look. He pictures a simpler, unembroidered waistcoat, satin breeches. He thinks of playing not only with the fabric textures, but with shades of purples. The waistcoat still royal purple, the breeches almost violet, all plain, letting the gold adornments shine solely from the beautiful coat. He envisions more intricate, more flamboyant lace on the shirt, a highlight and a framing for the coat. He wonders about dark stockings, so the whole body is wrapped in rich tones, highlighted with white only at the feet and the wrists and the neck. He's never been so drawn to a piece of clothing in his entire life. It would look perfect, stunningly, overwhelmingly, heartbreakingly gorgeous on the right person. It would look terrible on him. He buys it. For the next year, the purple coat rests, carefully wrapped in linen, in a second wardrobe, in an unused room. The coat, he calls it in his mind. Steed tries with steadily decreasing commitment to connect to his family. The children don't like most of his stories, they only like pirates, but the game really does give them nightmares. And then Mary is furious, so he brushes them off, retreats into his library. He feels Mary's fury less and less as she slips further and further away, no longer able to muster up enough emotional reaction to him to be angry. It's better in most ways. It's a lot worse in some. It's possible the vice did its work, because now Steed is unmoored, drifting in the wind. The estate runs itself, just about, and Steed lets it. He does things that don't feel real, despite the evidence in the household's budget book. Buying the purple velvet was like releasing a cork from a bottle of champagne. And now he can't seem to stop buying clothes. He buys everything he imagined paired with the coat. And he loves how beautiful it looks, even though it sort of clashes. And he loves how beautiful it looks, even though it doesn't suit him at all. Then he lets himself buy what he knows he shines in. Aquas and sea foams, peaches and corals. He puts it all in the wardrobe next to the coat, not brave enough to wear any of it, to clash with the dark autumnal hues of the house. And then he buys a ship. Or rather, he buys an alarming amount of lumber and the services of an architect and of a carpenter's team. He tells himself that it's for his family. He sort of knows that it's not. He tells himself that someday he'll go back to the street vendor and give him a bag of coin and tell him that he's ready for a chef on his ship. His ship, designed for him, not for his father, not by Mary, his own. He mostly doesn't believe he'll do it. But one day, he does. It's funny, there were a few things that Steed brought with him when he fled his old life, that, once he was on the Revenge, he couldn't imagine why they ended up in his luggage. He didn't like Mary's painting when she gave it to him. Why bring it on the ship? Where its angular simplicity clashes with his otherwise ornate decor. The model Revenge was originally supposed to be just a placeholder, then something for the children to play with to get excited about their new home. And eventually, it was something for them to imagine their father on, once he was gone. But instead he took it, at the last minute, as he bid their sleeping forms farewell. As soon as Ed boarded the ship, carrying him, Steed knows but doesn't remember, always flushing when he imagines it. The mysteries behind these items started falling into place. Little keys unlocking doors he didn't know existed. The lighthouse saved them. Its light sparking their brains at the same moment, in the same way, the first of many times. Steed still doesn't really get the piece of art, but he loves it now. Every time he sees it, he feels both the electric sizzle of his thoughts aligning with someone else's, and Ed's arms wrapped around him in joy. The model ship was less complex. It was apparently just to make Ed giddy like a little boy. Ed had brought it out from its cabinet a few days after the Spanish, after the lighthouse, the clothing swap, the overwhelming everything of their meeting. On one of the first evenings they spent sitting together in the captain's cabin, sipping brandy and debriefing the day. "It's the ship! It's your ship!" he'd exclaimed, charmingly enthralled. "It is," Steed had answered, feeling the warm glow of brandy and of being understood. All the leftover things from his old life that didn't make sense now just feel like they just needed Ed to shine his light on them. So it's not a shock. It's barely a surprise when, once Ed's talked him into going to the inevitably terrible posh knob party, once Frenchie's departed with a suspiciously knowing smile on his face, Ed turns to Steed and asks, "So, what should I wear?" And another previously unknown key unlocks another hidden door. "I have just the thing," says Steed. "It's just been waiting for the perfect person." End of fic. I love that one. I've not read very many fics about Steed's kind of decision and leading up to leaving his family, and I think that one told it in a really lovely way, and I love the idea of him already having the purple suit, waiting for the right person. Please head over to AO3 and give Spanish for the car lots of love, likes, kudos, thank yous, comments, all of the things. That was read by me, Baby Kraken. Goodbye, friends.
That was Perfect on the Right Person by Spanish for the Car. And each of these were read by Baby Kraken. If you liked these fics and the lovely narration, head to the show notes for links to their AO3s where you can leave a comment and a kudos. If you'd like to narrate anything for the show, please do that. Really, no content limitations. Try to make it between 30 and 60 minutes, but if you do like a really, really short one, like a 5-minute one, I can add it to a compilation of others. If you do a really, really long one because you feel it and you want that, hey, that's fine too. But what's really important is just get the author's permission first, and then email the audio file to ourflagmeansfanfiction@gmail.com. And be sure to follow us on Instagram for hilarious memes and on YouTube for our live Gay Pirate News Hour shows, which are held at least once a month. Until next time, do creations, be cringe, commit crime. Bye!